Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm in awe of Barbara Beskind. Isn't she incredible? I was sitting back there with my mouth, an astonishing woman, a great woman, and the other panelists were terrific too. I wanted to pick up on something that Chris Scott talked about. And Bill Gates says it's pretty egocentric while we have malaria still and TB for rich people to fund things so they can live longer. And bioethicist Zeke Emanuel wrote in the Atlantic magazine not long ago a piece that you all should read, as Chris said. Americans seem to be obsessed with exercising, doing mental puzzles, consuming various juice and protein concoctions, sticking to strict diets and popping vitamins and supplements, all in the valiant effort to cheat death and prolong life as long as possible. This has become so pervasive, he writes, that it now defines a cultural type, what he calls the American immortal. We're going to take questions via Twitter, so I hope you'll weigh in there. So Kyra Bobinet, I want to go to you first.
Yes.
And say, are we obsessed, and do we have our priorities right?
Yeah, I think some people are obsessed. I think that, it doesn't matter what you do, it's why you do it. And I think that if your reason for, pursuing these things is narcissistic or, to the exclusion of other people's well-being, then it is a problem. However, I also think on the other side that, we have a problem with purpose and balance across all the generations. And I recently saw a study with the American Positive Psychology Association meeting around well-being and sense of purpose and how that precipitously drops after 75. And so I think that's a very legitimate problem that when families used to live in multi-generational settings, we used to have that balance and we used to have that natural longevity built in, that natural meaning and enjoyment and holisticness built into the system. And because we have fractured our family structures in this society, now we've got this hole. It's out of equilibrium with the rest. And I was very interested in honeybees, honeybee research, bees that go out into the flowers and that have a very short lifespan. But those that are reversed and brought back in to take care of the little babies, they live way longer, and all the genes for longevity turn back on. And so there's a sense of circular flow that I think we need to restore in mass.
Chris and Natrice and Barbara, what about this obsession? Are we obsessed, and is it something that we should be obsessed about?
I'll go. So I think there are two competing strains going on this obsession with long life or longer life. And one is the point that Zeke Emanuel and others, by the way, have brought up in the New York Times and other forums about technology and how we apply it to our lives and how we distribute resources to the best use for medicines. And these guys are folks that spend a lot of time at the bedside of patients. So Zeke, for example, is an oncologist. He has a career investigating the end of life and what it's like for individuals. And he is of the opinion that our focus on technology perhaps is misplaced on extending those last months or years, and rather should be, in his article, he argues, for spending the best amount of time we have with the people that matter in the lives that we have. So that's one side. The second side of this, to me, is probably even more interesting, and that is if we don't imagine a better future or a longer life or better health or better lifespan or health span, we'll never get there. So there is a competing set of tensions, I think, in this sort of discussion about how much do we want to push forward and imagine the future, and how much do we kind of hold back and say, let's focus on some of the real things that we have going on for us every day.
I want to come back in a minute to a question of the science of longevity, but I want to ask Natrice and Barbara, Natrice, you talked about moments that matter. And Barbara, you and I were speaking earlier this week. And you said you wanted to make a point about when we should not prolong life.
I think for anyone who wants to join the immortality movement, they should come and live where I live for a month. Be careful what you wish for. They have no idea that when they get to 90 or 105, as some of our people are, and in relatively good health, that they will have loss of spouse, loss of friends, loss of house, loss of cars, loss of balance, loss of hearing, loss of eyesight, and a few other things that diabetes and cardiac issues present. Just come and see it. You'll be careful what you wish for.
And Natrice, I presume that you would say the same thing, is that the moments that matter in life also escape at some particular point.
As a young person, I wanted to live forever. I'm now in my 60s. I don't want to live forever. Today is what I have. Today is what all of us have. Make today matter. And tomorrow, and just keep on taking those days up until your quality of life is to the point where that's a whole other subject. But I guess I want the focus to stay on today and now, not think about add 30 years to your life. It's not realistic. It's not practical. It doesn't work. I totally agree with Barbara. I'm very impressed with you. And I really appreciate your insight.
Chris, is the science of longevity about defying death or prolonging life, or are they one and the same?
Well, I'm no longer a bench scientist, used to be, so I speak for a little bit from the outside looking in on this. But from what I can tell, it's both. I think the focus has changed, however. So radical life extension to the tune of, let's say, 150 years or 180 years for humans was a focus of the 1990s, when the gene was found in mice and worms that would extend life by 2 or 3 times. That since has shifted, because it's a tremendously difficult thing to find the gene and the pathways in the human. So the focus now is, okay, if we can find those genes that might extend life, great. But let's focus on that period at the end of life that Barbara has mentioned, those years where we are in decline. I have a personal story about both parents. They're in their late 80s. They would say the same thing as you, Barbara, about just walk a step in my shoes and wish, if you really want to wish that you're 88, because you do lose a lot of things. And so Lee Hood at University of Washington puts it the best. He says, I think we're striving for some sort of research and some sort of discovery that allows us to live life up to the fullest, and then there's a switch. Now that's a little bit of a startling admission from a systems biologist, but his view is that if we can just get longevity, our later years, to be very helpful, we'll have solved most of the problems.
If science and technology could help us live, let's say, to 150, is that a worthy goal? Barbara?
Well, don't count me in. I mean, I have as rich a life as anybody I know at my age, at 91. I see what is in the future, and I hope it isn't for me. And just this week, the legislature here in California, for outsiders, you may not know this, but our legislature has now approved of assisted suicide in this state, and we have yet to wait until the governor signs it or doesn't sign it. But I get in the elevator and I see somebody who I know has some issues of stomach issues. It may be cancer that they haven't really told her about. She said, well, they can't find out what's wrong with me. And I woke up this morning and I wish I hadn't.
The reality. What about the
And
other?
people are ready to go. when people want to go, there's nothing that should really prevent that. And I think extending life, as much as I agree with medical science, and I have been an occupational therapist in the medical field for 44 years, and I certainly wouldn't denigrate anything that's being done, but be careful what you do. Just because it can be done doesn't mean it should be done.
That's great. That's right.
Natrice?
I totally agree with her.
Kyra, I want to ask you about the implications of the societal implications. The nation seems to be broadly ambivalent about using new medical treatments to live radically longer lives. In a 2013 survey conducted by Pew Research, 51% said they believe treatments to slow, stop, or reverse aging would have a negative impact on society. And 2/3 said they worry that radical life extension would strain natural resources, that only wealthy people, the 1%, would get access to new treatments, and that medical scientists would offer treatment before they fully understood how it affects people's health. What are the broader, what are the broader societal implications for all the panel that we really need to think through when we're thinking about extending life, when we're thinking about longevity research? This transition, what do we need to think about in the upheaval that's going to happen in society?
Exactly. I mean, I think it follows the patterns of any life-threatening illness, cancer, those kinds of things, where it goes down to individual choice. Some people want to fight hard. Some people feel reconciled to it. Some people try to live their days out in meaningful ways. There's all kinds of choices that are made. And I think the best we can do is make people aware of the consequences of their choices, much like the comments that were made about, walk in my shoes or those kinds of things. My own parents live in Oregon for the sole purpose of being in the assisted suicide realm, and I'm the person who has to make that call when the time is done. And so we've had a lot of conversations in our family around that. My own grandmother lived with my mother for 10 years in Oklahoma as her caregiver, and in the last year or two, she suffered from tremendous dementia because of this, just trying to keep her alive kind of stuff. And that's never anything she would have wanted. But my mother was too attached to her and wasn't ready to let her go. And so I remember just talking to a hospice nurse one time who said, the most important role of my job is to let each party know that it's okay to let go. Let the family know that it's okay, because they feel guilty. They want to prolong Grandma's life because they feel guilty, and then Grandma wants to hang around for them because she feels guilty for leaving them. And I think the conversation needs to shift more to that moment and prepare people for that conversation, and then the choices will be more clear and more healthy.
What about those societal upheavals, Chris?
Well, I go back to the first comment I made about how I think we need two things at the same time. I think we should be, and I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit here, I think we should be hesitant to kind of put the kibosh on big ideas, because if we do that too readily and say, this isn't for us as a society, it may never get done. So again, it's okay to think big. And if you have to think big about things like life extension or a significant difference in health span, do that. But when it comes to translating this to all of the people who support this, so people who vote, people who give money, and all the rest, I think you have to be pretty circumspect and honest about the drumbeat of biology, and it kind of marches at its own pace. And it may be one of those areas where we have high aspirations, but simply have not much to show for it. On the other hand, it could be one of those things where a real breakthrough is achieved. So I was just at an anti-aging conference down in Santa Barbara, and I heard a speaker say, I don't know about this life extension and stuff. He was a research scientist. He said, if we could figure out something as simple as muscle wasting, which causes a lot of falls, as you know, Barbara, that would be a Nobel Prize home run kind of thing. And from my own experience with my parents, those are the falls that have radically changed their way of life. And so things like that and the built environment, architecture, living well with family, all of that things, I think that should be also part of the discussion.
What are more of those big breakthroughs that people talk about? Can you be specific about some more?
You mean the scientific breakthroughs?
Scientific breakthroughs.
Well, again, without getting too deep into the science of it, read the Nature Biotechnology Review. The three pathways we talk about are pretty well described. I think that these are going to be incremental sorts of discoveries that are connected to that type of biochemistry. These aren't going to be the big fixes that simply say to us that we can increase our health span by 20 years and we'll all live till 95 instead of 85. So I think it's in the biochemistry. I think it's also with simple, rather kind of head-slapping ideas like the Alkahest case. So that was a company formed right here at Stanford based on mouse research that showed when you stitched an old mouse and a young mouse together and you injure the old mouse in one of their organs, that old mouse repairs itself as fast as a young mouse would without the system. So there's something marvelous in the blood, some protein, part of the communicome, that's reversing an aging or a deficit. So that trial, which is now a few months along in Alzheimer's patients, it could be something as simple as that. And that would be an amazing thing if those Alzheimer patients actually improve their memory and cognition based on this fairly simple blood transfusion. Actually, it's not blood, it's plasma. That would be an amazing milestone.
Natrice, you talked about moments that mattered in human capital, and I'm wondering if one of the things that we really need to be concerned about is that there won't be the human capital to nurture, to take care of, to be there for the aged as this population continues to grow larger and larger and larger.
It's already happening.
Can you talk more about that?
The last 10 years of my working life, which I'm 66 now, I worked from 50 to 60 in a nursing home. This is prior to the influx of the baby boomers, the numbers of increasing dementia and related health conditions. When you go to work and you're one person and you're given 13 people to care for, plus you have to assist them to eat, bathe, snacks, toilet, catch someone else as they're falling out of bed as you walk by their room. We're already in a crisis, and I don't think people understand how big it is. And I don't want to be in that crisis. I'll hang on to my own little place for as long as I can because I don't want to be part of that box, that I'm trying to think of the word, when you're in a business where everything's put in boxes and they're all shunted down the line. When you see wheelchairs put outside in the hallway from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock in the morning, that was 15 years ago. I did that. Between 6 and 8, I put people, and they slept in their chairs while they waited for us to wake them up and feed them again at 8. What kind of a life is that? That's not what I want.
So what are the public policy implications of this, Kyra and Chris? What do we need to be thinking about? What do legislatures and governors and public policy people and people in Washington, what do they need to be considering?
Well, I think some of the recent talk about paying for family caregivers to reimbursing them to take care of their elder parents or loved ones, I think is really important. And reimbursing for that, I think expanding the healthcare dollars beyond just the acute care setting and really extending that into what people actually need and what people actually want, and being more in dialogue with the public around where do you want these dollars to go, instead of it just following these well-worn ruts of higher and higher spending. I mean, hospitals having marble floors and those kinds of things are nice, but would you rather have that money over here? And there may be a good conversation to be had with community planning and that kind of thing.
From the research perspective, you might also think about how this type of research is funded by the NIH. So the NIH is very much an agency that funds experiments on disease. Mm-hmm. It's not an agency that funds research on aging, particularly. So people who work in the aging field in the basic sciences are complaining, with right cause, I believe, that the NIH should radically change its focus to rather working on disease silos, working across diseases, especially those diseases of aging. Mm-hmm. And so I think that would be a very important public policy change.
What would that take to accomplish that? How do you think that a huge bureaucratic organization like that changes direction?
I don't know. I know that one person suggested a National Institute of Aging. So we have a National Center for Aging at the NIH, which is chronically underfunded, but not an institute. So I think something at the institute level that high with researchers that are multidisciplinary in focus, not disease focused, but rather multidisciplinary, looking at inflammation, biochemistry, cell biology, across all sorts of ideas, is one way to go. The second thing I think is another interesting point about just the distribution of scarce resources. So if we imagine a Western world where the bolus of the population is in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, what kind of world is that for us? Mm-hmm. Now, I might be in that group at some point. We all might be. So what does that mean for pension plans, for insurance, for family structure? We're having a movement just the opposite in terms of family care structures, moving from caring for family members to away from that to more managed care and assisted living. So I think those are issues that baby boomers should be thinking about now. And if they've got the purchasing power still in reserve to actually do something about it, that's where I would put my money.
Kyra, you want to add
So,
something?
every day I think about behavior design, and I think that, there was an executive order last week signed by the president to require all federal agencies to adopt behavioral insights into their work. And for me, I think there's a big disparity between what people say they want, that most people don't want to be rotting away or those kinds of words, very common, and what we actually do. And so I think that someone needs to, and hopefully someone in this audience will design a way to close that gap between what we all have agreed that we don't want to happen to us and reinventing all the resources that we really would meet our needs and fulfill how we really want to live. And even if you look at Alzheimer's, which is a terrible affliction and prevalence and things like that, when you take posthumous autopsies, people who had grandchildren and really rich lives, but they had a lot of plaques, it doesn't show up. The phenotype of their behavior in life doesn't match what's happening in the brain upon death. And so there's another factor here of meaning, of reason for getting up in the morning, for designing for IDEO, those kinds of things that we need to design for, and really rethink the quality aspect, the quality variable.
Before we take a question from Twitter, Nick out here is going to read one. Barbara, you want to weigh in?
When I was at the White House Conference on Aging, many of these issues were addressed. You can get all this online. But one of the things that I was struck by was the amount of social impact that with the wage earners having to give up their wages, their work to care for a family member, which then it's just a cyclical downhill spiral. Mm-hmm. That was addressed a great deal, and also insurance and elder abuse and all kinds of issues but that was very well addressed. Some of these things were addressed at the White House conference.
Big public policy questions. Mm-hmm. Nick, do we have some questions from Twitter?
We do. There are many here that I'll condense into one question along the same theme, which is a focus on quality of life. And the common question is, how do we make the shift from focusing on disease care to quality of life being a thing we value as a society?
How do we make that shift? That's a big shift.
I would say that just like at this conference, the patient voice is turned up in volume. I would say that the public voice should be involved in every aspect of the process, so that that controls the matchup between how we spend our money and what we want. And I just feel like it's a breakdown of democracy that's not happening. It's more the other structures that are taking over.
How do we make that shift?
I'd encourage the group of Twitter questioners to read Oliver Sacks. So Oliver Sacks just recently died. I think it was pancreatic cancer. He wrote a series of essays in the New York Times, were just absolutely stunning, about the quality of the life that he lived with the time that he had left. And that's a really good reflective piece. I think it's instructive to everyone to read how important family is, how important basic things like enjoying the outside are, friends. He said famously in his second to last installment that he was going to turn off the TV. He didn't care about the Middle East anymore. And when you really think about it, when it really comes down to kind of what's valuable at the end of your life, he seemed to be, to me, to make some just amazingly good decisions.
Barbara, what's most valuable to you now? What do you not want to hear about anymore? And how do you want to spend your time? How have you decided that you want to focus on?
Well, as long as I can be engaged with people who have viable conversations, and I felt like until I got to IDEO that I was losing my vocabulary and my way of communicating, and that I wasn't finding people. Well, let me say it this way. IDEO gives me the opportunity to have a viable exchange with people who are creative, who share a passion for what I'm interested in, which is inventing and creating.
Natrice, do you have anything to add here?
I really admire you, and I think that you shouldn't be one of the few. You should be one of the many. There should be many
It should
more.
be one of the many. And the question that we have, really as a societal issue, is how do we do that?
Yeah.
The numbers are going to be dramatic. The numbers are going to be huge. And how do we continue to incorporate people like Barbara Beskind in the quality of life that we have? Any more questions from Twitter?
Yeah, shifting gears a little bit. Barbara, you said early in your interview that you have some things that young people don't have. You have the luxury of time, for instance. And on the other end of that coin, there was the comment about stitching mice together and healing at a younger rate. So the question for the panel is, what superpowers do the elderly have that everybody else could tap into?
It's interesting when you said that you have time, because one would think that you would say you don't have time. Can you talk about that?
I sit in the hallway beside a beautiful window that's sunny, so that I have the best light possible for what I need to do. And I have time to watch everybody walk by. And I know everybody by their gait and their voice. And I can see what the problems are. I mean, I have time to think. And I probably think 8 hours a day of what we need or what we're doing and how we can invent something to mitigate it. I've forgotten what your question was.
About time. You answered it beautifully. We just have 2 minutes left. Chris?
I was going to say, on the stitching together the circulatory system, so I've got a Twitter follower who is a Hollywood screenwriter, and he picked that up and said, wow, this sounds like a great a movie. And I wrote back and said, well, here's an even better idea. We'll have a mad scientist clone himself and then grow the clone up to be, a small child, and then stitch the child on the back, and then that'll kind of, follow the narrative arc. And he wrote back and said, too much. So there's too much sometimes on that. But on the basic thinking part of it, I think that's right. When I turned 60 last year, I changed something in my behavior, and that was time to think. And so now I spend hours, a couple of hours every day just thinking, because that's what's most enriching and rewarding to me. I'm not going to meetings, saying no to sometimes commitments that seem important, but maybe a little frivolous. So I think time is important.
One last question.
This is a great one to end on. Matthew Cree asks for everybody, if you could give your 25-year-old self some advice, what would you tell yourself and why?
What would you tell your 25-year-old self? Kyra, why don't we start with you?
I was very aggro at that age. I was in medical school at UCSF, so I would say slow down, and relationships are all that matter.
Oh, you're going down the, let's see.
Wear cool socks, for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, stay away from Bombay Sapphire Gin.
Natrice.
I would say that I've actually told this recently to a couple of young people I met. Advice I wish I'd had was to put some money in the bank, starting from the very first bank account you ever have, and don't touch it because you'll need it when you get older, because there won't be any money from the government. Finding that out.
Barbara.
I would just like to say that people under 30 are going to have a high risk of aging early because their posture is so poor.
I love it.
They never learned how to walk with a good stride, and a brisk walk 30 minutes a day will keep you younger anyway. But I think that the real risk is that they have forward posture. They're going to lose their balance earlier. I say ears over hips and hips over heels.
Awesome.
That's true.
That's great. And I tell my kids, try to live without fear. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you, Kat.